All right, everyone, welcome back. So here we are with our 100 Years' War Part 2, and we're going to kind of go through what happens, how this war ends. So we're going to cover a couple things in this lecture. We're going to wrap up the 100 Years' War, and we're also going to talk about this other important event as we talk about why the Middle Ages end, something called the Great Schism. So this is all part of the big theme of why does the Middle Ages end. So last time we had kind of talked about most of the Hundred Years' War, and we talked about the battles, the Battle of Crécy, the Battle of Poitiers, and of course the Battle of Agincourt. Henry V, he was victorious. He becomes forces the Charles VI to sign this treaty, and of course instead of Henry V becoming the King of France, in England it was his 2-year-old son Henry VI who became the King of England and France. And I said the kind of legitimate heir of the French throne, Charles the Dauphin, he's not happy. But I also said Charles the Dauphin was not that popular. He was not that charismatic. And really, he's going to have a hard time with things. But he is going to get help, I said. And the question is who comes to help Charles the Dauphin? Well, a very famous story that many of you have all heard of before, this lady named Joan of Arc. So we'll just briefly tell the story of Joan of Arc. I mean, Joan of Arc is a great story, and I always preface this by saying I always judge people's historical significance with if they weren't there, would anything have changed? And while Joan of Arc is a great story, if she never existed, our history of this event doesn't change. Because, I said, oh, somebody comes to help Charles the Dauphin, and it's true, Joan of Arc will help Charles the Dauphin, but the real reason that the tide of this war is about to change is because the King of France is a 2-year-old baby, and Henry V is dead. Once Henry V died, it was just a matter of time until the French take over, retake control of France. But I still want to tell the story of Joan of Arc because it's a great story. So Joan of Arc comes from a little peasant village called Domremy, and she is going to have these voices and visions at a very young age, telling her that she should go help Charles the Dauphin to help him take control of the crown of France. And Charles the Dauphin is desperate. He says, sure, no problem. And Joan of Arc gets involved. I'll take any help I could get. And Joan of Arc gets involved in this very famous battle called the Battle of Orleans in 1429. So let me go to our map here, and then you have Charles VII. Charles the Dauphin will become Charles VII. And so here we have our maps again. If you remember from the last lecture, this is kind of the first map where we started. And you had after the Battle of Poitiers, then after over here was after the Battle of Poitiers, then after Agincourt, and then right over here you have the Battle of Orleans. And what happens is the French win. Now, do they win because of Joan of Arc? No. Again, they win because the King of France is a King of England is a baby. But the French do win this battle. Now, in terms of the story of Joan of Arc, what does this mean? Shortly after this battle, she's going to be captured. And when Joan of Arc is captured, the French do already see her as kind of a good luck charm, essentially. Hey, she leads us she was part of the Battle of Orleans. We won. Yay, we love Joan. The British don't like Joan at all. And so when the British captured Joan of Arc, it was technically some allies of the British that captured her, but it doesn't matter. The British get a hold of her, and they accuse her of being a witch. And they put her on trial for being a witch. Now, when you put somebody on trial for being a witch, you can't just say they're a witch, you have to prove it. How do you prove somebody a witch? You ask them questions. You ask them questions in the hopes of tripping them up so they say something they could say, they're a witch. Joan, for a little peasant girl, was very smart, however, because every time they asked her a question, she always had just the right answer. One of the more famous questions they asked her once, they go, Joan, are you in a state of grace? Well, if you say, no, I'm not in a state of grace, and they go, you're a witch. If you say, yeah, I'm in a state of grace, and go, how would you know that? You're a witch. But she doesn't say no, and she doesn't say yeah. She says, if I am in a state of grace, may God keep me in it. If I am not, may God put me in it. And they're like, oh, how'd you get that one right? And they're all upset and everything. All right, but this is essentially what we have here, that they can't really pin her down until one of the judges finds some writing from some biblical writings that says a man shall not wear woman's clothing and a woman shall not wear man's clothing. And they go, now we got her, right? Because she's wearing man's clothing. She's wearing armor. They found her guilty and they burnt her at the stake. I believe it was 1431. And this actually backfires on the British. Why would it backfire on the British? The whole trial was a sham. Because, this just makes Joan a martyr. It makes the people in France even, oh, we're going to fight even harder, right? And they do. And what ends up happening, and you can see here in our last map, almost everything is back to green. The British lose all the control of France. Now, again, is it because of Joan? Joan definitely motivated them a bit. But the reality is, it's very hard for the British to control the French territory. The French don't want them there. The British have to cross the English Channel every time they want reinforcements. And so, long story short, the French eventually get the upper hand. Charles the Dauphin does become Charles VII. The kings of England remain the kings of England, and the kings of France remain the kings of France. And the two nations are these two independent nations, all the way, of course, until today. So the land really doesn't change hands much. From what we started and what we ended, it's very, very similar. So then the question is, why is the Hundred Years' War important? And the real significance of the Hundred Years' War is the effect it has on ending the Middle Ages. So this is the point that you really need to focus on, because what did the Hundred Years' War do? It changed warfare, right? You now have those who work. Remember in the Middle Ages, you had those who fight, those who pray, or those who work. Well, now those who work become those who fight. And therefore, the whole feudal structure is not going to work the same anymore. If I'm a king, I don't need to rely on nobles. I don't have to give nobles land to fight for me. I could just hire a bunch of peasants and I'm good to go. I got my army. So there's that. Another important effect that I didn't get into last time, but important to note this time, is as we get into the early 1400s, another part of warfare changes during the Hundred Years' War. And some of you may be aware of this. We start using gunpowder. Now, as the gunpowder age becomes more prevalent in combat, I want to think again, what does this mean for a knight on a horseback, right? I don't know if any of you have gone to the shooting range before or have gone shooting guns before, but if you ever do, try loading a gun wearing chainmail armor. Try firing a gun wearing chainmail armor. Try, moving cannons with chainmail armor or plate armor. It doesn't happen. You need to be fast. You need to be quick. You need to be mobile. And so the idea of a guy on a horse with a sword, not going to work. I mean, what's the old expression? Never bring a knife to a gunfight. Well, now we're at guns and cannons, and this is going to change things dramatically. And this is why the Middle Ages, at least the Hundred Years' War, is going to help end the Middle Ages. It's again one of these events that just kind of begins to shatter the model of the Middle Ages that we were talking about in the several lectures before this. And that's what I really want you to be able to do, is be able to explain how these events, the Crusades to some degree, the Hundred Years' War, we're going to talk about the Great Schism next, and then one more event after that, are all going to have a role in ending the Middle Ages. So that's kind of the focus here. All right, so that's it on the Hundred Years' War. We're going to go to our next slide and talk about another very important event during the end of the Middle Ages, what we call the Great Schism. So I'm just going to stay on this. This is kind of the last chart we're going to, the last slide on here. And the Great Schism, 1378 is when it happens. I'm going to go through all these words as we go through it. So I'm not going to change. So if you just want to write the words down as we're going through this time instead of pausing, that's fine. But let's go through, first of all, what the word schism means. Schism means a big split. So this story of the Great Schism specifically involves the Catholic Church, right, in Western Europe. And one of the characteristics of the Middle Ages was a really strong church. Well, the Crusades kind of dinged the church power a little bit. The Great Schism is going to ding the church power a lot. And I'm going to explain to you what it is. So we have to talk about, first of all, what led to it. It starts 1378. The events leading up to it start about 1305. So circa, if you want to remember, circa 1300. If you just want round numbers, that's, of course, fine. And so first I'm going to talk about the causes, then I'll talk about what it is and explain the ramifications of it. It's not going to take too long to explain. You see a lot of names here, but most of these are going to be just need to know the names, not a lot of detail. All right, so Philip IV, he was this very powerful king of France, if you remember. He was the one who put Boniface VIII in house arrest. And then shortly after that, Boniface VIII died. So again, this is why the Great Schism happens. Boniface VIII dies. He's the Pope. When the Pope dies, what you end up having is a meeting of what we call the College of the Cardinals. The College of the Cardinals is a meeting of all the top religious leaders in the Catholic Church. The archbishops and so they get together, and it's a big ceremony, a big event. They all go together in what we call conclave. They sit in and they basically pick one of their own to be the next pope. Pope dies, College of the Cardinals meets, and they pick the pope. I don't know if you've ever kind of paid attention in the news when this happens. They meet in the Vatican, and when if they don't figure out somebody, like a puff of gray smoke comes out, they burn. If they have somebody, a puff of white smoke go burn, and everybody cheers, and yeah, they figure out the new pope, and so forth. They've been doing this forever. So anyways, the College of the Cardinals meeting. And Philip was so powerful that he got the College of the Cardinals to select this guy named Clement V to be the Pope around 1305. And then Philip goes to Clement V and tells him, by the way, I don't want you living in Rome. I want you to move to France, specifically to the city called Avignon. So go to the city Avignon, and I want you to reside in Avignon, the city in France. Now, how long have the popes been living in Rome? Since the beginning of the church. And so this is a pretty dramatic event, but this is not the Great Schism yet. And so in 1305, the popes are going to start living in France. And from 1305, roughly, until 1377, for about 75 years, the popes are living in France and Avignon. Sometimes this is called the Second Babylonian Captivity. If you remember way back in the beginning of the semester, we talked about the first Babylonian captivity. That was when the Jews were held captive in Babylon. If you remember all that, this has nothing to do with Jewish people. Why is it called the Second Babylonian Captivity? Well, remember, to Catholics, the popes not being in Rome for about 75 years is the equivalent for the Jews not living in Jerusalem for about 75 years. So it was about the same amount of time. And so it was sometimes dubbed the Second Babylonian Captivity. So anyways, this already hurts the church a little bit, but that's small compared to what's about to happen. We get to 1377. 1377, the Pope now is Gregory XI. We've skipped several popes. Gregory XI becomes the Pope, and he says, I don't belong in Avignon. I belong in Rome. Packs his bags, goes back to Rome. That ends the Second Babylonian Captivity. But then, the very next year, 1378, he dies. What has happened? He dies. College of the Cardinals needs to meet. College of the Cardinals under tremendous stress, right? Because this new Pope, Gregory XI, had only lived in Rome back for 1 year. So if you think about it, for 75 years, your entire life, all you've known is popes living in France, Avignon. However, you also know that historically popes have lived in Rome. So if you're a member of the College of the Cardinal, you're going to be stressed, right? You're going to have people putting pressure on you, people threatening you. You better pick an Italian. If you don't pick an Italian, we'll kill you because we want Italian. If you pick an Italian, he's going to live in Rome. So there's a lot of pressure. Long story short, at the end of the day, the College of the Cardinals picks this man named Urban VI to be the Pope, an Italian, who's going to live in Italy, in Rome. Okay, this is the problem. Not all the College of the Cardinal members agreed. There were some members of the College of the Cardinals from kind of the French coalition who said, no, we don't believe Urban is a legitimate choice. And they argued that there was too many threats made against the College of the Cardinals, that this whole election was done with threats and intimidation. And really, we think Clement VII should be the Pope. He's a French guy. Guess where he's going to live? In Avignon. So what do you have in 1378? This is the beginning of the Great Schism, because in 1378 you have two popes, one living in Rome, one living in France and Avignon. Both popes claiming to be the legitimate pope, both popes excommunicating the other pope, and it is an absolute mess, right? And this is going to make the church look really, really bad, right? The church, is arguing. This goes on for a long time. This is going to go until 1420. At one point, there was a third pope even. There were actually three popes at the same time at one point. I think there was another guy living over in Spain. And so each pope claims to legitimate pope. It becomes political. Some countries support one pope. For example, if the French support Clement, remember, this is during the 100 Years' War, the British are going to support Urban. If the British support Urban, then Scotland is going to support Clement because England and Scotland hate each other, if you ever saw Braveheart. And so it becomes really ridiculous, and it really hurts the power of the church and the influence of the church. Eventually, we have this big council called the Council of Constance in 1420, and the kings of Europe get involved. And the kings of Europe say, okay, enough is enough. We really got to sort this out. We need a pope. We can't have this divided great schism. And they do eventually select this man named Martin V to be the pope, and the other popes are all out. And from their point on, we have one pope living in Rome, right? And the popes still live in Rome to this day. But for that moment of time in history, it was really bad timing because there was something else happening at the exact same time of the Great Schism that people were going to turn to for the church for help. And instead of the church being there for help, what's the church doing? Bickering on who should be the pope. So I'm hoping you're understanding how these events are starting to shatter the Middle Ages, right? So the Crusades, a little bit. The 100 Years' War, more so. The Great Schism, even more so. But then you have one more event that will forever change the course of Middle Age history and really forever change the course of Western civilization history. One of the maybe 3, 4, 5 most events in all of human history in Western Europe. And that event is what we're going to cover in our next lecture. All right, that's it. Let me know if you have questions. Thank you. And again, the only other reminder is, we're getting close to the final now. We're done with all the quizzes. So you really want to prepare. You've still got a couple discussion boards up, and then it's just a matter of prepping for the finals. So make sure you know it all really well. Remember, that's a good chunk of your grade. All right, that's it, guys. Thank you.